Nolan, get the F on the boat. Get on the boat. And Nolan said, no, I'm staying out here. I'm going to ride in with somebody else. And it's not uncommon to hear, but it's not like my buddy asked him one time. My buddy asked Nolan multiple times to get on the boat. Nolan, get on the boat. Get on the boat. We're leaving. If you're coming, you got to come now. And Nolan made a decision to stay out on the island.
The boat is pulling away from Horn Island. The water is choppy. The engine is straining against it, working harder than it should have to. 7 people are crowded onto the deck, holding the rail, looking back at the island behind them. Count them again, slowly if you have to. 7 people. 7. And no more than that. Nolan Wells is not one of them. Look again if you need to. 7 people, moving toward the mainland, away from the island where he was last confirmed to be. This is new footage. It surfaced days after investigators first said they had evidence that Nolan was still on Horn Island after his friend's boat left without him. Now there's video that appears to back that up. 7 people on the boat being towed off the island. No Nolan. If you've been following this case, you already know how many small pieces it's been built from. A phone call, a timeline, a handful of witnesses whose accounts don't quite line up. This is the piece that turns a handful of claims into something you can actually watch for yourself. This is an active, unresolved case, and some of what you're about to hear is still disputed. We're going through it carefully, one piece at a time. It starts with a phone call. Sometime around 4 in the afternoon on the 4th of July, someone on that boat picked up the phone to call for help. The boat was taking on water. A bilge pump had failed, and it wasn't keeping up. The caller wanted the boat, in his words, unsunk and towed back to shore. The dispatcher asked how many people were on board. The caller said everybody was accounted for. Young people, no children, nobody over 21. Help was on the way. A private towing service had been called, and a boat was dispatched to come get them. There's one more detail from that call worth knowing, because it ends up mattering later for how investigators pieced this whole timeline together. The towboat captain who was dispatched turned out to already be in contact with someone connected to the group, the grandfather of the boat's operator. That grandfather later let investigators search his own boat and pull the GPS coordinates off it, data that ended up helping confirm exactly when the group's boat actually left Horn Island. Without that cooperation, a lot of what we now know about the timeline down to the minute simply wouldn't exist. Except that's not what ended up happening. The towboat that actually showed up wasn't the one they called. Sources with knowledge of the investigation say a different boat, one that happened to be anchored near Horn Island at the time, saw what was going on and stepped in first. That boat towed Nolan's friends partway. At some point, the group managed to get their own engine working again, and they finished the trip back to the mainland under their own power. That's the boat in the new footage. The one being towed, then running on its own engine, carrying 7 people back toward shore. And this is the part that matters. Investigators had already told sources they had evidence that Nolan stayed on the island after his friends left. 2 witnesses reportedly told law enforcement they saw him there, after the boat was gone. This footage lines up with that. It doesn't prove it outright, nobody's saying that. But a boat carrying 7 people, filmed leaving the island where Nolan was last known to be, with no 8th person in the frame, is hard to look away from. Let's back up to what's actually agreed on. Nolan's friends say they told him to get in the boat. They say they wanted him to leave with them. They say he chose to stay behind, on the island, with a woman he'd met that day. Her sister has a different memory of it. She said she believed Nolan was in fact planning to leave with the group, that nobody intended to leave him behind. 2 accounts, not necessarily contradictory in the way you'd expect a cover-up to be, but not lining up perfectly either. The friends say they left Horn Island around 4:30 that afternoon. Someone else says they saw Nolan on the island as late as 6. An hour and a half. That's the gap this whole story lives inside. An hour and a half between the boat with 7 people pulling away and the last known sighting of an 8th person who should have been on it or near it and wasn't. Nolan was reported missing that night. His body was found 2 days later, on July 6th, in the water off Horn Island. A park ranger found him on the northwestern shore, not far from where his friends say they last had contact with him. It's worth understanding what Horn Island actually is, because it shapes almost everything about this case. It's a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. There's no shelter out there, no restrooms, no cell service to speak of once you're away from the mainland. People who go out for a 4th of July party are, in a real sense, cut off for the day, dependent on their own boats and whoever else happens to be anchored nearby. That's part of why the emergency call mattered so much in the first place. And it's part of why, if something went wrong for Nolan after his friends left, there may not have been anyone else immediately around to notice. The currents around Horn Island have a reputation. Local officials have said the area sees drowning cases with some regularity, cases involving people who knew how to swim, cases where the water simply won by exhaustion or by force nobody could see coming. That doesn't tell us anything specific about what happened to Nolan. It's context, not an answer, but it's the kind of detail that makes "he probably drowned" a reasonable starting assumption for investigators, even before anyone had reason to ask harder questions. And people did start asking harder questions. The local sheriff's office has said publicly that early on they saw no clear indication of a crime. At the same time, the sheriff has said investigators are working diligently to figure out exactly what happened, and that the family deserves a thorough, factual investigation. He's also said his office welcomes the family running its own parallel investigation alongside the official one. That's not a small thing. It means 2 separate efforts have been digging into the same 11 or so days, from the 4th of July through the recovery of Nolan's body, and comparing notes. Investigators have said they suspect he drowned. That word gets used a lot in coverage of this case, and it's worth being precise about what it actually means right now. Suspect is not the same as confirmed. The family didn't accept that as the final word. They sent Nolan's body for a second, independent autopsy, separate from the official exam handled by the state. That independent exam happened about 6 days after Nolan disappeared, 4 days after his body was recovered. By the time a pathologist could examine him, the state's own medical examiner had already conducted the primary autopsy, and some tissue and organs had already been removed for that first exam. That timing matters. Doctors will tell you a second autopsy is almost always working with less to go on than the first one. And this report itself acknowledged real limitations because of it. Even with those limitations, the independent pathologist noted something worth mentioning: an area of red discoloration on the back of Nolan's head. The report doesn't draw a conclusion from that. It doesn't say what caused it. It's simply listed as something observed, one more data point in a file that has a lot of data points and very few conclusions. The exam came back undetermined. Not drowning, not something else. Undetermined, pending further investigation. The pathologist who conducted it said he could not rule out that some non-accidental factor played a role in Nolan's death. He also didn't find evidence proving that one did. Both of those things are true of the same report. The state's own autopsy results from the official medical examiner haven't been publicly released yet, pending toxicology. Two separate investigations, two separate exams, and as of right now, neither one has landed on a final answer. That's where the science currently stands, and we're not going to pretend it says more than it says. So here's where the new footage actually leaves us. It doesn't answer the biggest question in this case. It doesn't tell us what happened to Nolan on that island in the hours after his friends left. What it does is narrow the timeline. It confirms in a very concrete visual way that when that boat left Horn Island, Nolan wasn't on it. 7 people in a spot where an 8th should have been. That single detail is doing a lot of work right now. It's the difference between a story someone tells investigators and a piece of footage anyone can watch and count for themselves. Witness accounts can be argued with. A camera either shows 7 people or it doesn't. There's also something almost mundane about how this piece of evidence came together, and that's part of what makes it credible. Nobody set out to film proof of anything. A boat was in trouble. Somebody grabbed their phone, and years of true crime cases have shown the same pattern over and over. The footage that ends up mattering most is rarely the footage anyone intended to be evidence. It's the footage that just happened to be running while people were focused on getting home safely. That's likely exactly what happened here. Someone was documenting a stressful, chaotic afternoon on the water, and only later did anyone realize what was and wasn't in the frame. Think about the mechanics of it too. A boat calls for a tow because it's taking on water. The service they call dispatches a boat, but a completely different vessel, one that just happened to be anchored nearby, gets there first and does the actual towing. That's not a suspicious detail on its own. Boats help other boats out on the water all the time, especially near a barrier island where everyone's aware help can be slow to arrive. But it does mean the chain of who saw what that day is more tangled than a simple call and response. With one towing company, there's the tow captain who was dispatched. There's the grandfather he was in contact with. There's the boat that actually showed up and did the work. Multiple people, multiple boats, multiple partial views of the same afternoon, and Nolan wasn't confirmed to be with any of them once that boat pulled away. There's still no footage, publicly available at least, of what happened to Nolan after that boat pulled away. No camera picked him up walking the shoreline, or waiting for another ride, or anything else. The trail, as far as anyone's shown, goes cold right around the time that boat's engine started. And that's exactly why the timing of this video matters so much. It doesn't close the gap. It defines it. Before this surfaced, you had friends saying one thing and witnesses saying another, with no way to line either of them up against something independently verifiable. Now there's a piece of footage that at least confirms half of that gap for certain. Nolan was not physically present when that boat left the island. Whatever explanation eventually comes out for what happened next has to account for that one confirmed fact. It's also worth being honest about where this footage came from and what that means. It wasn't filmed or verified by the outlet reporting on this case. It was obtained through a third party. That doesn't make it fake, and there's no indication anyone's disputing what it shows. But it hasn't gone through the kind of independent authentication that would let anyone call it settled, courtroom-ready proof. Treat it the way investigators reportedly are treating it right now, as strong corroborating evidence for what witnesses already said, not as the final word on its own. This video does carry some difficult and disputed material, and we want to be upfront about that before we go any further. Nothing here is being presented as confirmed beyond what's been independently verified, and where accounts conflict, we've tried to show you both sides rather than pick one for you. Step back from the footage for a second and remember who this is actually about. Nolan Wells was 18. He played college football. By every account from the people who knew him, he was the kind of person who made a room better just by being in it. His mother has said publicly that he brought joy and light to everyone around him, and that losing him is a pain she can't measure. That's the part that's easy to lose track of in a story that's become, at this point, mostly about timelines and footage and forensic reports. Somewhere underneath all of it is a family that still doesn't know what happened to their son, and a group of friends who have to live with an afternoon that ended in a way none of them expected. That's also part of why this case has drawn the attention it has. It isn't just true crime curiosity. It's a family standing in front of cameras again and again, asking the same basic question in different ways. What happened to our son? And every new piece of evidence, including this footage, gets measured against whether it moves them any closer to an answer. Think about what we actually know, laid out in order. Friends call for help around 4 in the afternoon because their boat is taking on water. A boat that isn't the one they called shows up and starts towing them. At some point, their own engine comes back online. They make it back to the mainland. New footage from that trip shows 7 people on board. Nolan isn't one of them. Friends say they asked him to come. He stayed on the island with someone he'd met that day. Her sister remembers it differently. She thought Nolan intended to leave with everyone else. The friends put their departure at 4:30. A witness places Nolan on the island as late as 6. Nolan is reported missing that night. His body is found 2 days later in the water, off the same island. Authorities suspect drowning. His family's own pathologist can't rule out that something else contributed, and can't rule it in either. That's the case as it currently stands, with this new footage folded in. What's still missing is everything in between. What Nolan actually did after his friends left. Who, if anyone, was with him during those hours? Whether the sighting at 6 is solid or mistaken, whether the discrepancy between the friend's account and the sister's account means anything at all, or is just 2 people remembering the same afternoon slightly differently, the way people almost always do after something goes wrong. It's worth sitting with that hour-and-a-half gap for a moment, because it's really the whole case in miniature. At 4:30, by every account, Nolan is alive and on the island. At 6, by one account, he's still alive and still on the island. After that, nothing. No footage. No confirmed sighting. No phone record placing him anywhere. 90 minutes of a summer afternoon on a barrier island with no shelter and no cell service, and somewhere inside that window, something happened that nobody has been able to reconstruct yet. Investigators are still working through all of it. So is the family's own legal team, which has pushed back hard on the idea that this is a simple accident and nothing more. Nothing about that pressure changes what the evidence currently shows. It just means more of it is likely coming, and it means every new piece of footage or testimony from here forward is going to get measured against that same 90-minute window. It's also worth remembering how many pieces of this case have shifted just in the last few weeks. Details that seemed solid early on have needed correcting. Witnesses have added context that wasn't available at first. That's normal for an investigation this complicated, but it's also a reason to hold this new footage the same way, as an important piece of the picture rather than the final one. For now, what you're left with is a single striking image. A boat pulling away from an island with 7 people on it, filmed in a moment nobody involved seems to have expected would end up matters this much later, and a name that should have been an 8th, that isn't there. If this case is one you've been following, you already know how many turns it's taken. This won't be the last one. Stay with us for whatever comes next. Cases like this rarely move in a straight line. They move in bursts, a quiet stretch, followed by a single piece of evidence, that reshapes everything people thought they understood. This footage is one of those bursts. It won't be the last one. There's still a state autopsy pending, still toxicology results nobody's seen, still an active investigation working through evidence the public hasn't been shown yet. Every one of those has the potential to shift this story again. For now, what's confirmed is narrow but real. A boat left an island with 7 people on it. An 8th person, who was supposed to be somewhere nearby, wasn't in the frame. Everything else, why, how, what came next, is still being pieced together. If you want to keep up with how this develops, go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps more than you'd think.